Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video lecture for our Philosophy of Food class. In this module, we are going to continue talking about freedom and liberalism as it relates to paternalism. We're going to be building upon these topics that we talked about in our last module last week. But this week, we are going to look more specifically at Pollan's book, In Defense of Food. Specifically, we're going to consider what he says in chapter 5 and 6, where he talks about the lipid hypothesis, and this chapter 6, eating right, getting fatter, which seems sort of like a paradox or a kind of a contradiction. So those are the main issues that we're going to kind of go through in this video. We're really just going to kind of take a romp through these issues. And I really want to focus our discussion here and push it towards this point about moralization or this kind of moral panic as it relates to obesity and fatness or kind of fat phobia. In fact, the other video that I'm going to have you watch is a video and kind of an interview actually by Kate Manne, who recently published a really incredible book on fat phobia. It's called Unshrinking. So that's kind of the other video I want you to pay attention to. It's much longer, but very, very helpful, and it really digs into this issue that we're concerned with for this week. So before we get into Paulin's book in these couple of chapters, I do want to turn back to what Placius said previously that we considered last week and thinking through food, chapter 7. Because remember, Placius closes that chapter calling our attention to an important kind of moral panic that exists in our society with regard to the sort of social policing, the kind of policies that we put into place regarding people's bodies, especially women's bodies. So she there asks us to think critically about how do we conceptualize healthy eating, especially as it relates to this concept of obesity, which really seems to carry a kind of medicalization of this concept. And she notes that obesity is treated like a disease or like some sort of an illness, pathology that we need to be concerned with. And when we do this, when we medicalize a term like obesity, that requires professional management or intervention in some regard. But that medical framing, you might think, actually carries a lot of moral sort of baggage with it. To be fat is not simply to ask whether or not the person has the right health, whether they are in poor health per se, but rather instead it becomes a kind of a social or moral failing on behalf of the person that experiences of life with a body that's fat. And here I'm not using the word fat in a pejorative sense. I'm just describing a type of body that somebody might have. And I'm trying to do what Placius, as well as Kate Manne will do later on, which we'll see, is trying not to attribute this moral dimension or medicalized dimension to the term, which we do seem to have in obesity. Right. Obesity seems to carry with it this notion of there's some disease or something wrong that needs to be fixed. So Placius points out that we often treat thinness and self-discipline as a kind of virtue that we should ascribe to, whereas fatness or obesity is a sort of vice. It's a kind of it's a way of thinking about the evidence we have to suggest that somebody is lazy or somebody's not in control of themselves, or maybe they just are ignorant in some sense or are less of a person. So these are very moralized assumptions that are, I think, very ubiquitous in our culture, and they're produced by the kind of culture that we're in, and they're not quite biologically determined. So I think it's important to kind of call to mind, remember what Placius was saying at the end of that chapter, where her point was to try to show us that a concern about bodies is never really quite about health. Instead, it's about virtue or self-control or being responsible for one's health. And so this kind of moral panic that arises out of all this discussion about obesity and so forth serves to, I think, enforce various norms that we have in society, norms of behavior like certain forms of appearances, especially thinness. And notice that these norms, these social behaviors, also seems to mirror or run parallel with different lines of gender categorization, right? Gender and class, as well as race. And so Plakius again is really kind of asking us to consider whether or not our so-called war on obesity really does a good job of promoting health, or is it better understood as a way of reproducing various social stigmas that already exist in a kind of patriarchal society, a very, very sort of misogynistic society that we live in. So keep all of that in mind as we now turn to Paulin's critique of nutritionism and modern nutrition science, beginning with what we are describing as the lipid hypothesis, which reveals a very important kind of parallel to the moral panic that we saw Placius discussing at the end of chapter 7, and that we are also going to see in the next video, where Kate Mann discusses this notion of fat phobia. So then to begin, let's turn to chapter 5 and Paulin's defense of food, where Paulin is revisiting one of the most influential scientific narratives of the 21st century. That is the belief that dietary fat, particularly saturated fat, causes heart disease, right? This is the idea of the lipid hypothesis. Comes out of U.S. Nutrition policy, various forms of food labeling, and different public attitudes towards eating. It's been around for decades. Right, so Paulin is quick to note that the hypothesis emerged in the 20th century largely through the work of various psychologists who proposed that there was a correlation between saturated fat intake and various rates of coronary disease, heart disease. By the 1970s, this had hardened into the official doctrine that fat makes you fat. And it clogs your arteries, right? As Paulin puts it. So it was kind of really just a hypothesis that then became an orthodoxy. But as Paulin is really quite careful to show, the evidence we have for this hypothesis, this so-called orthodoxy, or dogma, you might say, the evidence is lacking, right? The evidence is far less decisive than any sort of rhetoric might suggest. Indeed, when we look at these studies, it's quite alarming, right? The different population studies that were done were very much inconsistent. Clinical trials often failed to show that reducing dietary fat actually lowered mortality, and the complexity of human diets could not actually be captured by isolating any one particular nutrient. So Paulin calls this the melting of the lipid hypothesis, meaning that like there's reason to think that this hypothesis is no good. We should reject it. But a more scientific error, Poland suggests, is seeing it as a symptom of nutritionism itself. Right. So again, nutritionism is his term for a very reductionist ideology that treats food as a collection of nutrients rather than as whole foods within a cultural practice. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the semester when we were considering the metaphysics of food, what is food itself, and Poland, when we saw, when we looked at his readings previously at the beginning of the semester, he does, I think, a nice job of showing that nutritionism, the view that food just is these basic nutritional building blocks, is problematic in lots of different ways. And we saw the same thing when we looked at the very beginning of chapter 1, indeed, of Flacius's text on thinking through food. We're thinking about the metaphysics of food, and there was all sorts of different ways we could do this. And it looked like maybe some form of a social definition is a better way to think about what actually food is. Right. So if we're returning then to what Paulin tells us, nutritionism, according to Paulin, reduces eating to mere chemistry. Right. What we put in our bodies is nothing more than nutrients. Where the moral worth that we attach to this is not attached to persons, but to the nutrients that persons eat. So in the era of this lipid hypothesis, fat essentially becomes the dietary villain, right? Fat is what we should be worried about. And to eat fat was to be, in some sense, reckless or ignorant. Another way to put that is, as Flacius suggests, we can describe this sort of moralization around body size in the same way that Paulin describes moralization around nutrients. Right? He writes that in the late 20th century, the moral imperative of the movement was to eat low fat. I remember being sitting in the kitchen. I think this was in the mid to late 80s, and my mom and dad were talking about whether or not what they had just bought from the store was really butter. Right? The actual name of it was something like I can't believe it's not butter. And it wasn't. It wasn't real butter. And so like this was certainly alive in public discourse. I remember very explicitly having all kinds of different discussions about we got to make sure that we eat these new dietary whatever. So my mom was always big on all kinds of different dietary foods and meals and so forth, in order to make sure that we were quote unquote eating right, eating healthy. So food companies or all sorts of different, capitalistic corporations or whatnot, they were capitalizing on this moral mood of the day, on this imperative of eating right and eating low fat. The imperative of the moment was we needed to make sure that we understood eating right as a kind of moral duty. So we had a moral, maybe even a public obligation to eat low-fat yogurts or low-fat cookies or low-fat cheese puffs or whatever it was, right? Yet Americans grew heavier and sicker. And that's the weird thing, right? Pollen suggests that what we are experiencing was not nutritional enlightenment, but actually a new form of dietary ideology. And more specifically, this was one that displaced much earlier moral codes about temperance and gluttony, and replaced that with specific scientific kind of language to try to prop it up and give it some sort of authority that maybe it didn't actually deserve. Now, in regards to this idea that nutritionism, according to Poland, is a kind of moral ideology, notice that Poland's argument in this part of the chapter is not anti-science at all, right? He's not saying that science is bad. He recognizes the importance of nutritional research. That's not the problem. But he instead is warning that when science becomes an ideology, it becomes politically motivated in some regard, or maybe even an essential part of your religious or cultural community, right? Then it functions more like religion, insofar as it's offering different kinds of commandments. Thou shalt not eat fat. If you eat butter, that's a sin, right? These sorts of views. So under this kind of nutritionism, the good eater does not question what the expert scientific authority tells them. And notice how this again echoes Plakia's account of moral panic at the end of chapter 7. Right? Both writers are really kind of showing how the scientific discourse on these issues is bringing about some sort of a moral discourse and intertwining these issues. Right? So what begins as a very simple empirical claim about diet then turns into a judgment about character. Right? Pollan calls this the healthism of modern food culture itself. And that's the belief that the moral person is the one who eats correctly. Right? Improper eating amounts to improper moral behavior. So this, I think, helps us understand why Pollan is calling nutritionism a kind of ideology rather than actual science. It has these sort of metaphysical concerns as well. Nutrients are the true realities behind food. And insofar as there's this kind of metaphysical element of what's really food, we also get a very specific kind of moral code that emerges from this. The moral code tells us to avoid bad nutrients or that we should pursue the good nutrients. Again, there's this real kind of like metaphysical emphasis involved here. We also have an important kind of epistemological aspect involved here too, one that privileges the experts over the eaters themselves, one that privileges, a politician that knows what's best for society over the people living in society. And that seems to result in an important kind of anxiety and confusion, and certainly a huge amount of guilt about eating itself. Pollan calls this an American paradox. And as we turn to what Kate Manne says in the next video, we'll see the same point being raised, how there seems to be a huge amount of guilt and shame that's a result of this sort of anxiety and confusion, all intertwined around body size and shaming somebody's experience as a person because of what their body is like, because they're not thin as it's to be expected. Right. So this American paradox, it seems to be very, very real. It involves a population, our population here in the United States, that's obsessed with nutrition. And that's paradoxical because the more we're obsessed with nutrition, nonetheless, the less healthy we actually are. So having laid that American paradox on the table here, let's turn to the chapter titled "Eating Right, Getting Fatter." Right, that chapter begins with this paradox, and Pollan's quick to observe that this paradox seems to be really kind of on the rise or emerging out of the 1970s, precisely when Americans started following the low-fat guidelines. Rates of obesity and metabolic diseases started to rise quite sharply, and so he asks, how could eating right make us less healthy? Now, I do want to point out something important here. I think that it's better to understand this as a correlation and not necessarily a causation. And that's because there's always lots of different aspects involved, lots of different things that we need to take into consideration in the context of a person's health and weight. Not everybody's body's the same. Different people experience all sorts of different things, and their lived experience is not something that we can wrap up in a single sort of situation and say, well, this is the cause of that. But certainly it does look like there's a clear correlation here between the fact that, you know, the Americans started following these low-fat guidelines with regard to obesity and so forth. And then at the same time, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, all the way to today, we see that there's, a significant rise in obesity as well as metabolic disease and so forth. And how can that happen if everybody's now eating right? Now, of course, Pollan's answer, as you might have predicted, is essentially a continuation of his critique of nutritionism. So, by demonizing things like fat, public policy and food marketing encourages massive substitution of refined carbohydrates and sugars. Right. So what we replace with fat is carbohydrates and sugars, or trans fats or whatever else. These so-called low fats. So the new low fat products were often actually much worse than what they were replacing. Insulin spikes increased fat storage, and the sense of virtuous eating masked overconsumption, right? So we were eating the right things, which seemed to suggest we could eat much more of it. And Pollan calls this a nutritional whack-a-mole. And you can see how that might be happening, right? Each time one nutrient is declared dangerous, another is anointed as its healthy substitute, and only for the cycle to repeat over and over and over again. The deeper problem, of course, is that the industrial food system's dependence on cheap, processed ingredients like corn syrup and refined flour, hydrogenated oils, or whatever it is, these keep both the profits and the calorie counts as high as possible. Again, I think a major part of this issue has to do with the fact that we are living in a capitalist society, one that's sort of maximizing profits to the extreme, and an important way to do that is at the cost of the consumer, the person's health. And importantly, I think Pollan recognizes this well. Pollan notes that this shift also changes what we mean by food, right? So we begin to view eating not as communal, right? Eating is no longer really considered a cultural act. And I certainly agree and understand where Pauline's coming from here. So I don't even remember the last time that I sat down, outside of a restaurant, sat down with my family at a table to eat a dinner. This rarely happens, except for maybe at like Thanksgiving. And even at Thanksgiving, oftentimes we're just carrying around a paper plate and we're talking and we're eating and we're standing. We're not even sitting down anymore. So it's not really this kind of communal cultural act. Instead, it seems to be treated as a kind of technological performance of health itself. People monitor their grams of fat, they track their calories, and they tend to feel guilt and shame when they're not doing this properly. It's a sort of gamification of eating right. You get more points if you eat correctly. You get higher scores when you have fewer calorie intake and so forth. And so certainly you can feel virtuous depending upon the numbers that you score, right? If you get a high score, then you're going to feel like a superior person. And you might feel guilt and shame if you score poorly that particular day. Again, eating has become a kind of a game that we're playing. Likewise, supermarkets become, as Pollan puts it, a moral landscape divided between the good and the bad foods. And oftentimes people will talk about this, how the good foods are on the outskirts of the supermarket, and all of the bad foods are in the middle of the supermarket. And so even this way of kind of classifying things and sort of conceptualizing it, here again, the moral and the medical are actually conflated, right? There's a moral aspect that seems to be involved with the medical aspect of eating properly and proper health. And so to eat incorrectly is just to risk things like heart disease, is to fail as a person, insofar as you have a responsibility as a modern subject, as a individual in modern society. And Placius also reminds us of this, right? Placius reminds us that such moralization does not fall evenly on everyone. Women and the poor are, or maybe the marginalized individuals who are living in communities that don't have the same sorts of resources that are available to other people. These are oftentimes the targets of nutritional surveillance and blame and shame and so forth. So let me say a little bit more than how we can bring Placius and Pollen together on these points. So we've seen how Placius and Pollen both illuminate the same kind of cultural logics that are involved, but from different angles. Remember, Placius is attempting to show how bodies themselves are policed, morally speaking, where fatness becomes a sign of vice, and obesity is overly medicalized, rather than treating fat body just as what it is and accepting people without shaming them and treating them as being or treating them as irresponsible in some regard. And Pollen, on the other hand, shows how food and nutrients are morally policed as well, how fats become the villains in all of this. So both of these perspectives involves what we might call a kind of disciplinary power or a kind of disciplinary authority, where the internalization of various cultural and social norms, expectations about health, and self-control and so forth are really brought to the fore. Right. So Pollen gives us a kind of historical narrative that concentrates on the actual concrete real cases of study. In fact, I one of the readings that I have for you here, this is a really interesting, I think, critical review that was done, types of dietary fat and risk of coronary heart disease. This is the actual article that Pollen cites at the beginning of the chapter, and he goes through and talks about how this article does a great job of showing how the science does not actually add up. There's many problems with the scientific research that was done that gave rise to the kind of lipid hypothesis that he's discussing here. And of course, this historical narrative gives us these sorts of, real cases to think about. The lipid hypothesis, if what Pollen is suggesting here is correct, clearly had a lot to do with reshaping the way in which we are thinking about the dinner table from a very sort of ethical point of view, where there are virtuous eaters and less than virtuous eaters, right? There's a kind of way of thinking about the various vices that we have. So a good citizen is somebody then who's going to eat low fats. A bad citizen is going to be somebody who eats a lot of fat and a lot of calories, right? And notice that it's the industries that benefit the most were those that are able to sell the illusion of health in the form of processed products. And of course, Plakia's philosophical point that we saw last time, uh, I think it helps us to step back from the ideology that Paulin is discussing here. If moral worth has become entangled with things like body size, thinness and fatness, and then our public health discourse has really ceased to be purely medical and has become ethical, right? There's a kind of moralization that's involved here. And so that then brings us to what Kate Mann describes as fat phobia. So that's the final thing that I want you to pay attention to this week for this module. The next video is an interview that Kate Mann has done where she talks about fat phobia. She argues that fat phobia is not simply an aesthetic sort of judgment that we make about people's looks, or maybe a moral judgment about somebody's health. But instead, it's moralized social attitudes themselves that are rooted in different power and gender norms, kind of misogyny that's involved here. Indeed, in this interview, Kate Mann explains that fat phobia functions much in the same way that misogyny does, insofar as it enforces conformity to various social ideals of what a body should be like, by framing noncompliance as moral failure. Right? To be fat is to be perceived as lacking willpower. To be fat is to be less than disciplined or to lack any sort of self-respect. Precisely the traits that some sort of a neoliberal culture treats as virtues. So it's in this sense, then, fat phobia is a kind of or a form of moralism that disguises itself as health discourse. Likewise, Maine notes that this moralism is gendered. Women and minorities are disproportionately subject to body surveillance and moral judgments about eating. Right? To be a good woman, you might say, on this criticism of fat phobia here, to be a good woman is to take up less space, to be skinny, to eat modestly, to exercise self-control. Thus, fat phobia is intertwined with patriarchal expectations about what it is to be a woman, about femininity, restraint, and the visual aspects of your body, what it means to be beautiful and so forth. And so connecting all of this then back to Pollan, his critique of low-fat ideology exposes how scientific authority actually reinforces these same sort of moral hierarchies, right? The command to eat right quickly then becomes be right, where being right means something like be thin, be disciplined, and be compliant to what society expects women to be like. This notion of beauty is thinness. And so these are the things that I want you to consider and think about as you're turning to Kate Mann's the interview with Kate Mann in the next video.